All right, everybody. This is our lecture recording for the parent-child analogy for revolution. This is for dates August 24th and August 25th. So we're going to jump right into it. This is going to be a bit different as far as presentation goes. These will ask more questions, put you in more of like a hypothetical scenario setting, which is going to be pretty interesting and fun. So that being said, we're going to go ahead and get started. So our first point is your parents are concerned that you are hanging out with some troublesome older friends. They tell you to stay away from these friends. How would you respond? So think for a second how you would respond. Most of us would be like, ooh, like I want to obey my parents and I want to listen to them, but at the same time, I like hanging out with my older friends. I don't know if I want to stay away from them. That'd be my personal opinion. I know everyone's opinions kind of vary here, but this slide goes along with the slide from before. So you'll see this one and this one will be together. So we have the navigation acts. So what the navigation acts were, in 1651, colonists could only trade with Great Britain. So that's what it was established from these navigation acts. It was effective in preventing the colonists or the colonies from trading with other European countries. So it limited the colonists to only trade with Great Britain. The Navigation Acts really imposed burdens on colonial manufacturers and merchants who wanted to ship and send their goods and resources to other parts of the world, but they couldn't. The passage of the Navigation Acts contributed to the rising of this anti-British sentiment and eventual outbreak of the American Revolution. So these slides, what we'll see, just like the getting to the American Revolution. So these acts and the different laws and regulations that the British impose on the colonists and the colonies slowly but surely led to this American Revolution. So you have colonists can only trade with Britain, mercantilism. Who do the troublesome friends represent? Other countries. Why did the British want the colonists to trade only with them? To make the most money. You start to play in a really cool treehouse near your backyard with your troublesome friends. Your friends tell you that the treehouse belongs to them, but your dad says he disagrees. He says that it lies within your family's property and belongs to your family. Your friends disagree and begin to pick on you every time you try to enter the treehouse. One day your dad sees this and kicks your troublesome friends out of the treehouse. How would you respond to that? In this instance, this analogy represents the French and Indian Wars. These wars were also known as the 7 Years' War. This New World conflict marked another chapter in the long imperial struggle between Britain and France. France's expansion into the Ohio River Valley brought repeated conflict with claims of the British colonies. There were a series of battles that led to the official British declaration of war in 1756. It lasted, as the name says, 7 years. The Treaty of Paris ended the war in 1763. It was in February. The British received Canada from France and Florida from Spain, but permitted France to keep its West Indian sugar islands, and it gave Louisiana to Spain. The arrangement strengthened the American colonies significantly by removing their European rivals to the north and south, and by opening the Mississippi Valley to westward expansion. So really securing the borders and French bitterness over the loss of most of their colonial empire contributed to their intervention on the side of the colonists in the Revolutionary War. So we'll learn a little bit more about that later. But the French did not like the British. So in this instance, the British and American colonists battled the French and Indian allies for control of the interior of the continent. What does the treehouse represent? You have the interior of the continent Native American French territory. And then what did the British gain in the French and Indian Wars? More land. Your parents banish you from the treehouse. They tell you to stay out of the treehouse as to avoid all future problems with your troublesome friends. Do you stay out? I probably would, because I want to respect my parents, but at the same time, whenever your parent tells you something, you usually want to do the complete opposite, right? So we have the Proclamation Act of 1763. It was issued on October 7th. It was issued by the British at the end of the French and Indian War to appease Native Americans by checking the encroachment of European settlers on their land. It created a boundary known as the Proclamation Line, which separated the British colonies on the Atlantic coast from American Indians west of the Appalachian Mountains. King George declared all lands west of these Appalachian mountains, so the Appalachian Divide, off limits to the colony settlers. So the colonists didn't like this because it closed down colonial expansion westward beyond Appalachia. So another event that made the colonists frustrated, and it became an event that made them a little less happy with Britain. So you see British draw a line and told Americans to keep out, wanted to prevent future conflicts. Why would the colonists want to go west? Get more land, obviously. They had just fought in the French and Indian Wars. And the proclamation, why was it ineffective? Colonists went anyways. You can't enforce it. It angered the colonist. Your parents take away your allowance so they can build a big fence to keep all your troublesome friends out of the treehouse. How do you respond to this? This one kind of stinks. I'd be frustrated. I'm sure all of you would be frustrated as well. Taking away your allowance and then telling you can't hang out with your troublesome friends. Double whammy, right? So we learn about the Stamp Act. Stamp Act, March 22nd, 1765. It was repealed in 1766. It was the first internal tax levied directly on the American colonists. It imposed a tax on all paper documents in the colonies. The British Empire was deep in debt from the 7 Years' War and looking to the American colonies as a revenue source. It argued that only their own representative assemblies could tax them. So the American colonists argued that. And the colonists insisted that the act was unconstitutional. It issues a tax and representation raised by the Stamp Act. It really strained relations with the colonists. They thought the tax was not fair to them. It was unconstitutional in their minds. So colonists organized protests, and then they were so angry about the Stamp Act because it taxed all legal documents, almanacs, and other items. So here's an image of the royal stamp. Your parents agree to give you your allowance back, but just to show you who's the boss, they tell you that you will have to start paying money to play your video games and use your cell phone. How do you respond? I would assume all of you would be frustrated, pretty angry, pretty upset. We got the Townshend Acts. So we have the British withdrew the Stamp Act but passed the Townshend Acts as a way to tax goods and maintain discipline over the colonies. This happened in 1767. What these acts did, it taxed goods imported to the American colonies. These American colonists who had no representation in Parliament saw the acts as an abuse of power. The British sent troops to America, or to the American colonies, to enforce the unpopular new laws, further heightening tensions between Great Britain and the American colonies. So these acts just they one up each other, and each time the American colonists get more and more mad. So this slide, video games represent trade with other countries and imported goods. What type of goods? We have imported goods, and do the colonists react? They boycott British goods. Your parents tell you that you can play video games again, but you can only play games that your parents select. The game that your parents have selected is called Rock Band Justin Bieber. Sounds like a pretty fun game to me. How do you respond? Limiting you to only one video game when you have other video games like Call of Duty, Madden, 2K out there, I'd be pretty mad too. We have the Tea Act, 1773. The Tea Act imposed on the American colonists so this Tea Act was imposed because the British government was in a lot of debt. The Act's main purpose was not to raise revenue from the colonists, but to bail out the floundering East Indian Company, or East India Company. So the colonists resisted. It culminated into the Boston Tea Party of December 16, 1773. Colonists boarded the East India Company ships and dumped their loads of tea overboard. Parliament responded with a series of harsh measures intended to stifle colonial resistance to the British rule. You have an image of the Boston Tea Party here. Justin Bieber game represents tea tax, and how did the colonists react to the Tea Act? Boston Tea Party. You destroy your family's copy of Rock Band Justin Bieber. Your mom freaks out. It was her favorite game. Awesome. She banishes you to your room, takes away your allowance and cell phone. She also disables the internet connection, so you have no way of communicating with your friends. You are no longer allowed to leave the house under any circumstances until the game's paid for. You must also apologize to your parents and prove your commitment to the family by singing all Justin Bieber songs out loud in the front yard. Justin Bieber has some catchy songs. I don't think that's that big of a punishment, but to each their own. How do you respond? You respond, in this case, it'd be the Intolerable Acts. This is in 1774 of March. Parliament was really fed up with the colonial antics. In response to the Boston Tea Party, the Intolerable Acts were 4 measures. They were enacted by the British Parliament. It was aimed to restore order in Massachusetts and punish Bostonians for their Tea Party. So the 4 that we're going to talk about, we have the Boston Port Act, which closed the port of Boston until damages for the Boston Tea Party were paid for. You have the Massachusetts Government Act, which restricted Democratic town meetings and turned the governor's council into an appointed body. You have the Administration of Justice Act. British officials were immune to criminal persecution in Massachusetts. And then you have the Quartering Act, which required colonists to house and quarter British troops on demand. The colonists' response to this legislation, Parliament hoped that the acts would cut Boston and New England off from the rest of the colonies and prevent unified resistance to British rule. What happened? Other colonies rushed to the city's defense, sending supplies and forming their own congresses. So you'll see that there. First Continental Congress meets. Your parents discover that you have hidden an iPhone in your closet. They heard you tapping out a text and playing an iPhone game at one night. Your sister tells you that she heard your parents whispering that they are going to sneak into your room early in the morning, take your last prized possession. How do you respond? Lexington and Concord. So basically, it was a battle fought April 19th, 1775. Hundreds of British troops marched from Boston to Concord in order to seize the arms cache, so the arms supply. Paul Revere and other writers sounded the alarm, and the colonial militiamen began mobilizing to intercept the Red Coat column. The confrontation was on the Lexington Town Green, and that's where the fighting began. So soon the British were retreating in the Lexington and Concord area. This was the first of many battles. So we're going to end it here. I know that was a lot, but pretty interesting. This was the events that led up to the American Revolution.